The fog came off the river first. It rolled up from the Thames in the dark, thick and yellow, and crept along the stones of the borough. Gaslight hissed on every corner. The lamps glowed like small wet moons. The doors of the public houses stood half open, and warm air drifted out into the cold. It was winter in old London. The year was 1897, and the city did not sleep. Carts rattled over the wet cobbles. Somewhere a barrel rolled across a cellar floor. The smell of beer and coal smoke hung low in the lanes, and the river breathed its damp breath over it all. Above one of these public houses, a single window glowed. Behind the glass, a woman lay in a narrow bed. She had been sick for many long weeks. Her body was thin now, and her skin had turned the colour of old wax. A man sat beside her in the lamplight. He held a small glass to her lips and told her to drink. The medicine was bitter. She drank it anyway, because she trusted him. Outside, the fog grew thicker. The lamps burned on, and in the quiet room above the noise of the street, the slow poison did its patient work. Chapter 1. The City of Yellow Light. Good evening and welcome. This is the Bedside Historian. The night is quiet now, and the world has grown small and soft, and wherever you have laid yourself down to rest, you are safe here, and you may let the long day slip away from your shoulders. Take one slow breath and let it go, and let your thoughts grow still. There is nothing you need to do tonight except listen and drift, and let an old story carry you gently into sleep. Before the tale begins, it would be a kindness to know who is listening. So in your own quiet way, think of where you are resting tonight, in what city or what small room, and what the hour reads on the clock beside you, whether it is late evening or the deep middle of the night. And if these slow histories bring you any comfort, and if they help to still your mind when the day has been heavy, then it would mean a great deal if you would subscribe to the channel and let this video play on to its end. Every soul who joins us helps these forgotten places stay remembered, and helps these long-gone lives find the people who need to hear them. So settle in and grow heavy, and let us drift backward together, far from this night, into the fog of a city that has long since vanished from the earth. The river came first, as it always did. It moved through the heart of the old city in a slow brown coil, wide and cold and patient, and it carried on its back the barges and the colliers and the little ferry boats, and it carried also the smell of tar and salt and rot that never truly left the air. By night the Thames lay black under the bridges, and the lamps on the embankments threw long yellow ribbons across the water, and those ribbons shivered and broke whenever a herry slid by. The tide came in twice a day and went out twice a day, and when it went out it left behind a shining grey shore of mud, and on that mud, even in the dark, he could sometimes see the mudlarks bending and searching, children mostly, looking for a nail or a scrap of coal or a coin to sell. Up from the river the fog began to rise, and in this city the fog was a living thing. It was not the clean white mist of the open country, for it had mixed with the smoke of a million coal fires, and it had turned thick and yellow and heavy, and it tasted of soot when it touched the tongue. The people of the city had a name for it, and they called it a pea-souper, because it hung so thick that a man could stretch out his arm and lose sight of his own fingers. On the worst nights the fog swallowed the gas lamps whole, so that each lamp became only a faint glowing smudge, a small drowned moon, and a person walking the street could see no more than one lamp ahead before the next was lost in the murk. Those lamps were the eyes of the city, at night. All across London the gas lamps stood on their iron posts, hissing softly to themselves, burning a pale yellow flame behind their dirty glass, and at dusk the lamplighters came out with their long poles to wake them one by one. A lamplighter walked the same streets every evening of his life, and the children of the lanes knew him and followed at his heels. And he reached up with the small flame at the end of his pole and touched it to the mantle, and the lamp caught and glowed, and he moved on to the next, leaving a trail of soft light behind him in the gathering dark. By the time full night had come, the whole city was strung with these little fires, mile upon mile of them, along the great roads and down the meanest alleys alike, and from a high window the city looked like a net of yellow stars laid over the black ground. The streets beneath those lamps were paved in stone, and the stones were never still. By day the great roads roared with traffic, with omnibuses pulled by tired horses, with hansom cabs, whose drivers sat high and proud behind their fares, with carts and drays and barrows pushed by hand, and the noise of the iron wheels on the cobbles rose up between the buildings like the sound of a falling sea. The costermongers cried their wares from the curb, selling oysters and eels and cresses and hot baked potatoes, and the flower girls stood at the corners with their baskets, and the crossing sweepers swept a clean path through the horse dung for any gentleman who would toss them a copper. The smell of the streets was the smell of horses and smoke and frying fish and unwashed clothes, all of it together, and it filled every breath a person took. By night the great roads grew quieter, but the city did not sleep, for London never slept. The night had its own trade and its own people. The watchman made his slow round. The constable walked his beat in his heavy boots and his caped coat, the bull's-eye lantern hooked to his belt, and he tried the locks of the shops as he passed and listened at the mouths of the alleys. The night soil men came out with their carts to empty the cesspits while the rest of the world lay abed, for there was much of the old way still left in the city, and not every house had its drains, and in the poorer quarters the people who had no bed of their own walked the streets until dawn, or paid a penny to lean against a rope strung across a crowded room, and slept standing up, hung over the rope like washing, until the morning came and the rope was untied. 2 parts of this vast city matter most to the tale that follows, and they sat one on each side of the river. To the east, downstream, lay the docks and the crowded lanes of Whitechapel and the parishes around it, where the ships of the world unloaded their cargo and their sailors, and where the poorest of the poor were packed into rooms and cellars so tightly that whole families lived in a single chamber. To the south, across the bridges, lay the Borough and the streets of Southwark, an old quarter of breweries and tanneries and hop warehouses, of narrow courts and crowded tenements, where the public houses stood close together on every street, and the smell of malt and hops drifted on the damp air. It was the public house that lit the dark in these places. The gin palace and the tavern and the corner beer-house glowed with warmth and noise, while the streets outside stood cold and wet, and their windows of cut and frosted glass threw out a buttery light onto the pavement. Inside, the gas jets flared along the walls, and the long counter shone with polished wood and gleaming brass, and the great barrels and bottles stood ranked behind the bar like soldiers. The floor was strewn with fresh sawdust to soak up the spills, and the air was thick with pipe smoke and the sour sweet smell of beer, and the talk rose and fell, and somewhere a piano might be playing, and for a few hours a poor man could buy himself a little warmth and forget the cold room waiting for him at home. Beneath these houses lay the cellars, and the cellars were a world of their own. Down a steep flight of worn stone steps, behind a heavy door, the great casks of beer rested in the cool dark, and the publican kept his store of bottles and his spirits and his cleaning things on the damp shelves. A cellar smelled of earth and old wood and spilled drink, and the only light came from a single candle or a small gas flame, and the sounds of the bar above came down muffled through the boards, the scrape of feet and the clink of glass and the steady murmur of voices. A man who held the keys to a public house held the keys to all of it, the bright bar above and the dark cellar below, and the rooms upstairs where the family slept. And what passed in those upstairs rooms was no one's business but his own, for the city kept its secrets close. In a place so vast and so crowded, where the people came and went and changed their names and their trades and their lodgings as easily as they changed their coats, a man could lose himself entirely. He could arrive from a far country with no history that anyone could check, and he could call himself by one name in one street and another name in another, and few would think to question it, for the city was full of strangers and the city did not pry. A landlord asked for the rent and not the truth. A neighbour saw a man behind his bar and took him for what he seemed to be. And the great fog rolled in each evening and wrapped the whole place in its yellow arms. And under the fog the city was a place where a watchful and patient person could do a great deal of quiet harm, and no one above the stairs would ever hear a sound. So the lamps burned on through the long nights, and the fog came and went, and the river slid by under the bridges, cold and brown and old. The omnibuses ran, and the cabs rattled, and the public houses filled and emptied and filled again, and the whole enormous city breathed in and out, as it had for 1,000 years. Somewhere in the crowd of it, in one of those bright bars or one of those dark cellars, a quiet man with steady hands went about his work, a man no one looked at twice, a shadow moving through the yellow light. The city did not notice him. The city had too much else to do, too many lives to hold, too much noise and smoke and hunger to attend to, and it let him pass. as it let 1,000 others pass, unmarked and unremembered, a single dark thread in a cloth woven of 10,000 others. And so the great city settled into its night. The last omnibus rolled home, and the gas lamps burned low in their glass, and the fog lay over the rooftops like a hand laid gently over a sleeping face. In the public houses the gas was turned down and the doors were barred, and the streets emptied, and the only sound left was the slow drip of water from the eaves and the far cry of a boatman down on the dark river. London lay still under its own breath, vast and patient and full of secrets, and it waited, as it had always waited, for the morning to come. Chapter 2. A village far to the east. Far from the smoke of the great city, far to the east beyond the cold grey sea, and beyond the wide plains of the German lands, there lay a flat and quiet country of fields and forests and slow brown rivers, and it was here, and not in London at all, that this story truly begins. The country was called Poland, though in those years it was not free to call itself anything, for the great empires had broken it apart between them long before, and the eastern portion where these fields lay had fallen under the rule of the Russian Tsar. The people who lived there spoke Polish in their homes and prayed in their old churches, but the law above them was the law of a distant emperor, and the soldiers who kept that law wore the uniform of a foreign crown. The land itself was low and broad and open. In summer the fields of rye and wheat and flax stretched away to the edge of the sky, pale gold and green under a wide pale heaven, and the wind moved across them in long slow waves, so that the whole country seemed to breathe. The roads between the villages were earth and dust, rutted by cart wheels, soft mud in the spring rains, and hard frozen ridges in the deep of winter. Here and there a windmill turned its great arms against the sky, and the storks built their broad nests on the chimneys and the cart wheels set up high for them, and in the long evenings the smoke of the cooking fires rose straight up from the thatched roofs into the still air. In the small village of Nagorno, near the town of Kauyol, the houses were low and built of timber and clay, with roofs of thatch or wooden shingle, and they stood close together along a single muddy street. Each cottage had its small plot of ground, its garden of cabbage and beet and potato, its few hens scratching in the yard, perhaps a pig or a goat tethered behind. The families that lived in them were poor, in the way that country people had always been poor, working from the first grey light to the last, bound to the turning of the seasons, to the sowing and the reaping and the long hungry waiting of the winter months. They were faithful people, and the church stood at the centre of their lives, and the bell of the parish church called them to mass on the holy days, and tolled slow and deep when one of their number was carried to the churchyard. It was into such a place, in the cold middle of December, in the year 1865, that a child was born to a carpenter named Antony and his wife Emilia. The father worked in wood, as his trade demanded, and a carpenter in such a village was a man of some small standing, for he made the things the others could not make for themselves, the doors and the window frames, and the simple furniture, the coffins for the dead and the cradles for the newborn, and the smell of cut pine and fresh shavings would have filled the small workshop where he laboured. The boy grew up among that smell, among the sound of the saw and the plane and the steady tap of the mallet, in a house where work was the whole of life, and where a child was set to useful tasks as soon as his hands were strong enough to hold them. The winters in that country were long and hard and white. The snow came early and lay deep, and the rivers froze, and the short days closed in quickly so that the lamps were lit in the afternoon. A family kept close to the great stove of glazed tile that stood in the corner of the main room, and they burned wood and peat to hold off the cold, and the windows grew thick with frost on the inside as well as the out. In the deep of such a winter a child learned patience, for there was little to do but wait, and learned to watch the slow turning of the world from behind a frosted pane, and learned the quiet that comes to people who live far from the noise of cities, in small places where every face is known, and every day is much like the one before it. The summers, by contrast, were brief and green and full of work. The whole village turned out to harvest, the men with their scythes moving in a line through the standing grain, the women binding the sheaves behind them, the children carrying water and gleaning the fallen ears. The hay was cut and dried and stacked. The flax was pulled and laid to rot in the ponds, so that its fibres could be drawn out for linen, and the fruit was gathered and the cabbages salted down in great barrels against the coming cold. It was a life lived very close to the ground, very close to the turning of the year, and it had been lived in just this way by the people of that country for longer than anyone could remember. When the boy had reached the age of 14, he was sent away from the carpenter's bench to learn a different trade, and he was apprenticed to a surgeon in the town of Zwolle, the man who practiced the old healing arts of the country. This was a great step for the son of a village carpenter. For a surgeon, even a small-town surgeon, stood far above a worker in wood, and the family must have looked on the boy's leaving with both pride and sorrow, watching the cart carry him off down the dusty road toward a future none of them could see. A paper kept from those years, found long afterward among his belongings, recorded that he had served his master well, that he was diligent and of good conduct, and that he had studied the art of surgery with a ready will. The surgery he learned was the surgery of that time and that place, and it was a craft far older and far rougher than the word might suggest today. The country surgeon was not a great physician of the universities, but a practical man of the body, a man who set broken bones and lanced boils and pulled aching teeth, who dressed wounds and treated fevers with the remedies that had been handed down for generations. Chief among his tools were the lancet and the leech, for the healers of that age believed deeply that much of human sickness came from bad blood, from too much blood, from blood that had grown corrupt within the body, and that the surest cure for many an illness was to draw some of that blood away. So the apprentice learned the keeping of the leeches. The leeches were kept in tall glass jars filled with water, dark slender creatures that clung to the glass and waited, and they were brought out and laid upon the skin of the patient where the blood was to be drawn, and they fastened on and swelled slowly with the dark blood until they fell away of their own weight, fat and sated. He learned to apply them to the temple for a pain in the head, to the chest for a sickness of the lungs, behind the ears and along the limbs as the master directed. And he learned the cupping glasses too, the small heated cups set upon the skin to raise a blister and draw the humours to the surface. These were the medicines of the day, and the people believed in them, and the surgeon who practised them was trusted and respected and welcomed at the bedside of the sick. The young man proved apt at this work. He had steady hands and a quiet manner, and there was in him from the first a coolness around suffering, an ability to stand close to pain and blood and fear without any tremor, which in a surgeon was counted a virtue and a sign of a strong nerve. He watched the bodies of the sick and the dying with attention. He learned where the great vessels ran beneath the skin, and how the body was put together. He learned the names and the natures of the medicines on the apothecary's shelf, the ones that healed and the ones that harmed, for the same shelf held both, and in that age the line between the cure and the poison was a thin and shifting line that every healer was expected to know. In time he left the small town and made his way to the great city of Warsaw, the old capital of that broken country, and there he sought to climb higher in his chosen trade. He gave himself out as a student of surgery, and worked for a season at one of the city hospitals, in the quarter of the city that lay across the river, among the wards of the sick and the injured and the poor. The course of study he followed there was brief, only a few months by the records that survive, and he did not rise to the rank of a fully made physician. But he served as an assistant, a helper at the bedside and in the operating room, a man who had learned enough of the healer's art to handle the instruments and the medicines and the suffering flesh, but who had not the standing of a true doctor. And here, in the great changing city, far from the quiet fields of his birth, the young man's path turned at last toward the west. The country of his childhood was poor and ruled by foreigners, and its young men looked outward toward the larger world, toward the great cities of the German lands, and beyond them toward the richest and largest city of all, the vast smoke-wrapped capital that lay across the sea. Many thousands made that journey in those years, leaving the villages and the towns of the east behind them, carrying their few belongings and their trades and their hopes across the long miles of Europe toward the promise of work and a new life. And so, sometime in the latter part of the 1880s, this one among the thousands gathered up what he had, his certificates and his instruments and the cool, quiet skill of his hands, and turned his face toward London. The village of his birth knew nothing of where he went or what became of him. Nagona kept on as it had always kept on, the storks returning each spring to the chimneys, the bell of the parish church tolling over the fields, the carpenter's workshop filling with the smell of cut pine, the snow coming down in winter to lay the whole flat country under its silence. The people there rose and worked and prayed and slept, and the years turned over them as the years had always turned. Slow and patient and unremarked, far from the great city and all that the great city would come to hold. The wide fields lay quiet under the wide pale sky, and the wind moved across the grain in its long slow waves, and the little village by the river kept its peace, and it did not know, and it would never truly know, what had walked out of it down the muddy road toward the setting sun. Chapter 3. The Trade of Blood and Leeches. There was a trade, old as the cities of Europe, that joined together two things which seem to us now to belong worlds apart. For in the long centuries before this tale, the same man who cut your hair would also bleed you when you were ill, and the same shop that offered a clean shave offered the lancet and the leech and the drawing of an aching tooth. This was the trade of the barber-surgeon, and its sign hung above shop doors all across the cities of the old world, a pole striped in red and white, the red for the blood that was let, and the white for the bandage that bound the wound after. To the people who passed beneath it, that striped pole meant a place of small healings and small comforts, a place where a man went to be made neat and to be made well. And it was a trade trusted and familiar in every street. The roots of it ran very deep. In the far back centuries, the monks had done the bleeding and the simple surgery. But when the church forbade them such bloody work, the task had fallen to the barbers, who already kept the sharp blades in the steady hands the work required. So the barber became the surgeon of the common people, the one who served those who could not pay the great physicians, and his shop became a place of many uses. He shaved the beards and trimmed the hair, and he also drew the bad blood and pulled the rotten teeth, and lanced the swellings, and set the leeches, and dressed the cuts and burns of the working men who came to him. And he sold small remedies from the shelf behind his chair, salves and tonics and powders for this ailment and that. By the years of this story, the two trades had begun to part, and in the great cities the true surgeons had risen into a learned profession of their own, far above the barber's chair. Yet in the poorer streets the old joining lingered still, and a barber who had once trained at a surgeon's side carried that older knowledge with him, the knowledge of the body and the blood and the medicine shelf, even as he stood in his apron with the razor in his hand. Such a man knew more of the workings of flesh than his customers ever guessed, and he kept that knowledge quiet behind an ordinary face, and it sat in the back of the shop with the leech jars and the bottles, waiting, like a tool laid by for a use not yet come. The barber's shop itself was a place of small daily ritual, and in the poorer parts of the city it was a warm and humble refuge from the cold streets. A man pushed open the door, and a little bell rang above it, and inside there was the chair, and the great mirror, and the shelf of bottles, and the smell of soap and bay rum and warm water, and the faint sharp tang of the blade. The barber wrapped a cloth about the customer's neck, and worked up a lather in his bowl with the badger brush, and laid the warm foam over the man's jaw with quick sure strokes, and then took up the long open razor and stropped it on the leather hun by the chair until the edge was keen. And then came the shave itself, the blade drawn slow and close along the throat and the cheek, the customer leaning back with his eyes half closed, and his life, for those few minutes, entirely in another man's hands. It was a strange and quiet intimacy, that of the barber and the man in his chair, and it asked of the customer a deep and unthinking trust. The blade passed over the great vessels of the neck. The throat lay bared and open, and the man in the chair gave himself up to it without a thought, trusting that the hand above him meant him only the small kindness of a clean shave. The whole trade rested upon that trust, the trust of the body laid open to the steady stranger, and the barber who was honest repaid it 1,000 times a day with nothing worse than a nick of the chin. The trust was the heart of the work, and the work could not be done without it, and it was given freely by every man who ever sat down and tipped back his head and closed his eyes beneath the blade. When the young man from the eastern fields came at last to the great city, sometime in the closing years of the 1880s, it was to this trade that he turned, for it was the trade that lay nearest to the skill he carried. He did not come as a surgeon, for his papers from the old country meant little here, and he had never been fully made a doctor, and so he found work instead as a barber's assistant, lathering the faces and sweeping the floor and learning the new way of the trade in a new and foreign city. He settled first in the crowded eastern parishes near the docks, among the lanes where the poor and the newly arrived were packed close together, and he laboured in the shops there, a quiet foreigner with careful hands, learning the speech and the ways of the place around him. He worked for a time at one shop, and then took a place of his own, a small barber's shop in a narrow street near the river docks, a mean and crowded street of lodging-houses and beer shops in one of the poorest reaches of the whole city. The shop was listed under his name in the directory of the day, set down in the plain print among the 1,000 other small trades of the quarter, a barber among barbers, one more straight pole among the many. There he stood through the long days with his razor and his lather, serving the dock workers and the sailors and the labourers of the lanes, taking their pennies, sending them out again clean-shaven into the fog. An ordinary man at an ordinary trade in a corner of the city that no one of any standing ever troubled to look at. And all the while, behind the ordinary face and the apron and the steady working hands, there lay the older knowledge he had carried out of the East. He knew the body as the barber-surgeons of the old country had known it. He knew the shelf of the apothecary and what stood upon it. He knew that among the bottles sold openly in every chemist's shop in the city there were medicines that healed in small doses and killed in large ones, and that the line between the two was a matter of careful measure, a thing of grains and drops, known to those who had studied the healing arts and hidden from those who had not, unknown to those who had not. He carried this knowledge quietly, as a man carries a thing in his coat that no one can see, and he went about his trade, and he watched, and he waited, and he gave no sign. The city he had come to was a place that suited such a quiet, watchful nature, for it was a place that did not ask questions of a man. Among the crowds of the eastern parishes there were strangers from every land, men who had come from the far edges of Europe with little but the trade in their hands, and one more such stranger drew no eye at all. He could change his lodging and move to a new street and begin again among new neighbours who knew nothing of where he had been. He could let one name fall away and take up another, and few would ever know or care. For in those streets a man was taken simply for what he appeared to be, and the past he carried was his own affair, locked up behind his eyes where no neighbour could reach it. So he passed through the trade and through the streets, a barber, a foreigner, a man with steady hands and a quiet manner, and a knowledge of the body and the bottle that he kept entirely to himself. The customers came and sat in his chair and tipped back their heads and trusted him with their bared throats, and he shaved them clean and took their pennies and bowed them out the door, and not one of them saw anything in him but a careful tradesman doing careful work. He was, to all who met him, the most ordinary of men, neat in his dress, mild in his speech, soft-spoken and obliging, the very last sort of man that anyone would ever think to fear, and that ordinariness was the deepest part of him, the cloak he wore over everything else, the still grey surface beneath which the dark water ran unseen. The trade he plied was honest, and it had been honest in the hands of 10,000 men before him. A trade of small comforts and small healings, of warm lather and clean blades and the easing of the body's little troubles. The leech and the lancet had drawn the blood of the sick for the sake of curing them, and the bottle on the shelf had held the medicine that brought the fever down and the cough to rest. There was no evil in the trade itself, none at all, for it was one of the oldest and kindest of the small trades of mankind, the laying of gentle hands upon the suffering body. The evil, when it came, would come not from the trade, but from the one who turned it, who took the knowledge meant for healing and bent it slowly, patiently, toward another end entirely, and the trade would have no part in that, and would carry no blame. For now there was only the shop, and the fog at the door, and the long days of lather and steel. The little bell rang as the customers came and went, and the razor whispered over the leather strop, and the leech jars sat dark and waiting on their shelf at the back, and the bottles stood in their quiet row. The barber worked, and the city roared and smoked around him, vast and uncaring, and the river slid by cold and brown, a few streets away, and the great net of gas lamps waited for the dusk to wake it. In the crowded lanes the people went about their hard, small lives, trusting the men who served them, asking no questions, seeing nothing, and the quiet stranger with the steady hands moved among them like a shadow at the edge of the lamplight, unhurried, unremarkable, and entirely unknown. Chapter 4. The Autumn of the Knife. The autumn came down hard on the eastern parishes that year, and the fog came with it, thicker and yellower as the days grew short, settling into the narrow streets of Whitechapel and Spitalfields, and lying there for hours, like something that did not mean to leave. By 4 in the afternoon the lamps were lit, and they burned all through the long dark evenings, small smudged points of yellow strung above pavements, wet with mist, and the smell of the autumn was the smell of coal smoke and damp brick and the river, and under it all, faint and constant, the smell of too many people living too close together with too little of anything to go round. It was the year 1888, and the eastern quarter of the great city was about to become, for a few terrible months, the most frightened place on the whole of the earth. To understand the fear, a person must first understand the streets, for the streets were the heart of it. This was the poorest district of the richest city in the world, a warren of crooked lanes and blind courts and narrow passages where the sun scarcely reached the ground even at noon. The houses leaned together overhead, old and rotten and patched, and behind them lay the common lodging houses, the great crowded doss houses where a man or a woman could pay a few pence for a bed in a long room shared with strangers, or pay less and lean against a rope to sleep sitting up. Whole families lived in single rooms, and the rooms were damp and dark and crawling, and the water came from a single tap in the yard that served 100 souls, and the privies were foul and few, and over all of it hung the heavy air of poverty so deep and so old that the people who lived in it had long since ceased to expect anything better. It was a quarter of the desperate and the driven, and among the most desperate were the women who walked the streets at night to earn the few coppers that stood between them and the cold. They were not young, most of them, and they were not wicked. They were poor women, worn down by hard lives, by drink that gave a few hours of forgetting, by husbands lost and children dead, and work that had run out, and they walked the dark lanes after midnight, because there was nothing else left for them to do, and a fourpenny bed waited at the end of the night if only they could earn the price of it. They knew the streets, and the streets knew them, and they passed in and out of the lodging houses and the public houses and the shadows, and they looked out for one another, as the poor have always looked out for one another. And they had no notion, that warm end of summer, of what the autumn was bringing down upon them. It began at the end of August, on a dark street in the small grey hours, when a woman was found dead upon the pavement, and the manner of her death was such that the men who found her drew back in horror. Her name was Mary Ann Nichols, and she had been 43 years old, and she had slept in the lodging houses and walked the streets like so many others, and now she lay still and silent in the lamplight, with her life poured out around her. A little more than a week later, in the grey yard behind a house in Hanbury Street, a second woman was found in the same dreadful way, and her name was Annie Chapman, and she too had been poor and worn and past her youth, a woman who had known better days and fallen from them by slow degrees into the lodging houses of the quarter. And the fear which had stirred at the first death now woke fully and stood up in the streets and began to spread. The newspapers seized upon it, and through the newspapers the dread of the Eastern Quarter became the dread of the whole nation. The papers were sold on every corner, a halfpenny or a penny each, and the boys who sold them ran through the streets crying the latest horror, and the people snatched them up and read by lamplight of the murders in the East, and the more they read the more afraid they grew. Letters began to arrive at the offices of the press and the police, some no doubt the work of cruel jokers, and one of these letters gave the unknown killer a name that ran like fire through the columns of every paper in the land and lodged itself forever in the memory of the city. From that day the shadow that walked the streets of Whitechapel had a name to be whispered, and the name made the fear worse. For a thing with a name is a thing that has come close enough to be known. Then came the night at the very end of September, when not one but 2 women were found dead within an hour and within a short walk of each other, and the city's terror rose to a pitch it had not known before. The first was Elizabeth Stride, found in a yard off a busy street, and the second was Catherine Eddowes, found in a quiet square not far away, and both had been poor women of the lodging houses, both past their middle years, both swallowed up by the same darkness that now seemed to hang over every lane and every doorway. After that night the Eastern Quarter scarcely slept. Women would not go out alone after dark. Doors were barred that had never been barred before. The public houses emptied early, and the streets that had always been full of late life now lay silent and watchful, and every footstep in the fog made the heart leap. The people did not wait for the law to save them, for they had little faith in the law, and so they took the watching of the streets into their own hands. The shopkeepers and tradesmen of the quarter banded together into a vigilance committee, ordinary men who gave up their nights to patrol the lanes in pairs with their sticks and their lanterns, walking the beats the police could not cover, listening at the mouths of the courts ready to raise the alarm. They printed handbills and posted rewards and walked until the dawn, night after night, through the cold and the fog, and still the fear would not lift. For the shadow they hunted left no trace and made no sound, and seemed to melt back into the murk from which it came, as though the fog itself had risen up and learned to kill. The police came in their numbers, more constables than the quarter had ever seen, walking the streets in their heavy boots and caped coats, and the great detectives of the day bent all their skill upon the case, and among them was an inspector named Frederick Aberline, a quiet and dogged man who knew the eastern parishes better than almost any other officer in the force. for he had walked their beats for years and knew their lanes and their people and their secrets. For he had walked their beats for years and knew their lanes and their people and their secrets. He and his fellows worked through the long autumn without rest, following every thread, questioning every suspect, chasing every rumour through the fog, and the whole weight of the law was thrown into the streets of Whitechapel, and still the shadow walked, unseen and unknown, and still the women died. The worst of it came in November, in a small rented room off a court, where a young woman named Mary Jane Kelly was found, and she was the youngest of them all, no more than 25 years old, an Irish girl who had come to the great city and fallen, like the others, into the poverty of the quarter. After that the killings stopped, as suddenly and as silently as they had begun, and the shadow that had walked the autumn streets simply went away. Back into the fog, back into the crowd, back into the crowd, back into the great anonymous mass of the city, and was never named, never caught, never truly known. The fear lifted slowly by degrees over the months that followed, but it never wholly left, for the quarter had learned a terrible thing about itself, that a man could move among the crowds of the poor, and do unspeakable harm and vanish without a trace, and that the city was so vast and so crowded and so indifferent, that it could hide such a one entirely within its folds. And here is the thing that matters most about that autumn, the thing that is too easily forgotten in the long telling and retelling of the horror. The shadow that the city feared was never the true story of those months. The true story was the streets themselves, the lodging houses and the blind courts and the single taps and the foul privies, the poverty so deep that women walked the dark to earn the price of a bed. The indifference of a great rich city to the suffering packed into its eastern corner. The killer was only a symptom of all that, a thing that the conditions of the quarter had made possible, a darkness that could only have moved so freely through streets already so dark. The real horror was not one man in the fog. The real horror was that such a man could find, in the heart of the greatest city on earth, a place so wretched and so unwatched that he could do his work and be swallowed up and never found. Through all of this, in the lanes of the eastern parishes, the ordinary life of the quarter went on as it had to go on. For the poor cannot stop living merely because death is near. The markets opened in the mornings and the costermongers cried their wares. The dock gates swung wide at dawn and the men crowded in to fight for a day's labour. The public houses filled in the evenings with those who could spare a penny, and the barbers stood at their chairs with their lather and their blades, serving the men of the streets as they always had. Among those barbers, in a small shop in one of the meanest streets near the river, the quiet foreigner from the eastern fields plied his trade through that terrible autumn, lathering and shaving and sweeping his floor, one more small tradesman among the thousands, drawing no eye at all. He was there in the quarter through every night of the fear, an unremarkable man behind an ordinary chair, and not a single soul who passed his door gave him a moment's thought. So the autumn of 1888 passed at last into winter, and the winter passed into spring, and the great fear faded into a memory and then into a story, told and told again, growing darker and stranger with each telling. But the streets remained, and the poverty remained, and the women who had been lost were laid in their graves in the cold ground beyond the city. Mary Ann Nichols and Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes and young Mary Jane Kelly. Poor women all, worn down by hard lives and then taken by the dark. The fog rolled in each evening over the lanes where they had walked, and the gas lamps burned low and yellow above the wet stones, and the great crowded quarter drew its breath and lived on, holding its dead and its terror deep within it, in the silence that lies beneath the noise of every living city. Chapter 5. The barber of Cable Street, down near the river, in the parish of St. George in the east. There ran a long crowded street called Cable Street, and it was a street that held within its single length the whole hard life of the docks. It lay close behind the great walls of the dock basins, where the ships of the world came to unload their cargoes, and so its trade was the trade of sailors and dock labourers, of men who worked the cranes and the warehouses and the holds, and of all the others who lived off such men, the keepers of the lodging houses and the beer shops and the deating houses, the women who took in washing, the children who ran the errands and picked the pockets and learned the streets. It was a poor street and a rough one, loud by day with the noise of the docks and the cries of the cellars, and at night it glowed with the lights of the public houses and rang with the songs of sailors far from home. The street drew its people from every corner of the earth, for the docks pulled the whole world in through their gates. There were Germans and Swedes and Greeks and Lascars from the eastern ships, There were Irish in great numbers fled from hunger across the sea, and there were the Jews of the eastern lands, fled from the cruelty of the empires to the east, settling in the crowded courts behind Cable Street, where they kept their own shops and their own speech and their own ways. A man might walk the length of the street and hear half the tongues of Europe spoken at the doorways. And in such a place a foreigner with an accent and an unfamiliar manner drew no notice at all, for he was only one stranger among a great crowd of strangers, all of them washed up together on this loud poor shore by the tide of the world's misfortunes. It was here, at a numbered shop along this street, that the quiet barber set up on his own account, sometime near the close of the 1880s, and his name and his trade were duly written down in the great directory of the city, set among the thousands of other small businesses of the year, a barber, at a number on Cable Street, plain and unremarkable in the print. The shop itself would have been small and narrow, as the shops of that street were small and narrow, with the one chair and the great mirror and the shelf of bottles and the strip of leather hung by the wall for the stropping of the razor, and a little room behind or above where a man might live. The bell rang over the door as the dockmen came in from their work, grimy and tired, to be shaved and trimmed for a few pence before they sought their beds or their drink. And the barber served them with his careful hands and his soft foreign voice, and sent them out again into the lamplit street. The street he had chosen lay close beside another, a short turning called Pinchin Street, and it was a corner of the quarter, as grim and as poor as any in the whole eastern reach of the city. The arches of the railway ran nearby, dark vaulted spaces beneath the lines where the homeless sheltered and the rubbish gathered, and the lanes round about were narrow and ill-lit, and known to the police as bad ground. In the autumn that followed the great terror of the quarter, a dreadful thing was found beneath one of those dark arches, the body of a woman whose name was never learned, left there in the shadow by hands unknown, and the horror of the eastern parishes flared up again for a season before it once more sank away. Such was the ground on which the barber's shop stood, a ground soaked in the poverty and the violence and the anonymous death of the great dock quarter, where a body might be found in the dark and never claimed, and where life was cheap and the fog hid everything. In this place and at this trade, the barber made his life, and he was not alone in it, for he had taken a wife. She was a young woman of his own country, a Polish girl who had come like him to the great city to make a life among the crowds of the eastern parishes, and her name was Lucy, and the two of them were married in the manner of their people, and set up their home together in the cramped rooms of the dock quarter. To the neighbours, they were a young foreign couple making their way, the barber and his wife working and saving and keeping to themselves, and a child was born to them in time, a small life brought into the smoke and the noise of the great city. There was nothing in the look of it to set them apart from 1,000 other young couples of the lanes, scraping a living from a small trade, hoping for better days, holding their child close in the cold rooms above the street. Yet behind the plain face of this domestic life there lay a thing the neighbours did not know, for the barber already had a wife. Far away in the old country he had left a woman to whom he was bound, and now in the great city he had taken another as though the first had never been, and when word of this reached the wife he had left behind, she did not bear it quietly. She crossed the long miles of Europe and came to the great city herself, this first wife, to find the husband who had abandoned her, and to claim what was hers. And for a strange time all three of them were caught together in the crowded quarter, the husband and the two wives, in a tangle that could not last. But the first wife, finding the second already settled and a child already born, gave up the struggle at the last and turned and went back the long way she had come, back to the old country and out of the story altogether, leaving the barber to the life he had chosen. The child did not live. In the close and unhealthy air of the dock quarter, where sickness ran easily through the crowded rooms and the water was foul and the smoke hung low, the little one fell ill and died, as so many of the children of the poor died in those years, carried off young before they had scarcely begun. It was the commonest of sorrows in such a place, where the burying of children was a thing nearly every family knew, and the small coffins went out from the lanes in a steady sad procession to the great cemeteries beyond the city. But it was a sorrow all the same, and it fell upon the rooms above the barber's shop as it fell upon so many others. The young couple were left with their grief and their small trade and the crowded street outside their door, and they bore it, as the poor bore everything, in silence, and went on. For a restless spirit moved in the barber, a spirit that would not let him settle long in any one place, and before many years had passed he turned his eyes once more across the water, this time toward the new world far to the water, this time toward the New World far to the west. With his wife he made the long crossing of the great ocean to the cities of America, seeking, as so many thousands of his kind were seeking in those years, a fresh start in a younger land, and there for a time they lived, and he plied his trade among the crowds of yet another foreign shore, that whatever he sought there he did not find or did not keep. And after a season he turned about and crossed the ocean once again and came back to the great smoky city by the brown river that he seemed unable to leave for long. While his wife, weary perhaps of his restlessness and his temper, did not stay long bound to him after their return. So the marriage came apart quietly, in the way that the poor came apart without ceremony or notice, and the wife went her own way into the great crowd of the city and out of his life, and the barber was left alone once more, a single man with his trade and his bottles and his careful hands, free to move where he would and to be whatever he chose to be. And this was the thing the great city granted him above all else, the thing it granted to so many of the lost and the wandering souls within it, the gift of beginning again. He could leave the dock quarter behind him, leave the street and the shop and the small dead history of his marriage, and walk away into the vastness of the city and surface somewhere else entirely, in some other street under some other lamp, a man with no past that any neighbour could read, free to lay down one life and take up another as easily as a man lays down one coat and takes up the next. Cable Street kept none of him after he had gone. The shop passed to other hands or fell empty. The bell over the door rang for other men, and the great loud life of the dock quarter rolled on exactly as before, indifferent to the coming and going of one quiet barber among its thousands. The ships still came in through the dock gates at dawn, and the labourers still fought for their day's work, and the sailors still sang in the public houses at night, and the fog still rolled up off the river to fill the narrow lanes, and the dark arches of Pinchin Street still gathered their shadows and their rubbish and their homeless poor. The street had seen 10,000 strangers arrive and 10,000 depart, and it would see 10,000 more, and it remembered none of them, for it was only a poor crowded street by the docks, and it had no memory and no use for one, and the barber who had stood and shaved there was already forgotten before he was well out of sight, and the river ran on past the great walls of the docks, cold and brown and patient, carrying its ships and its barges out toward the open sea, and the lamps of Cable Street came up yellow in the dusk, as they came up every dusk, and the long crowded street settled into its noisy nights and its weary mornings without a thought, for the quiet man who had passed through it and was gone. Somewhere in the great spread of the city, under some far lamp, that man was setting down his razor and turning his patient mind toward a different trade entirely. But the dock quarter did not know it, and would never know it, for the dock quarter had already closed over the place where he had been, the way the brown water of the river closes smooth and dark over a stone that has dropped from sight and sunk down out of the light, forever. Chapter 6. The House Behind the Bar. There was no place in all the great city that glowed so warmly against the dark as the public house, and there was no place so much the heart of the common life of the streets. On every corner of the poorer quarters one stood, and often two or three within a single short street, their windows of cut and frosted and coloured glass throwing a rich buttery light out across the wet pavement, their doors swinging open and shut all the evening long to let out the warmth and the noise and the smell of beer into the cold. To the working people who lived in the close dark rooms of the lanes, the public house was the one bright and welcoming room in all their world, a place warmer than home and brighter than home and far more full of company, and they came to it as moths come to a lamp, drawn out of the cold streets toward the light and the heat and the forgetting that it offered. The grand ones were palaces indeed, fitted out by the great brewers to draw the trade, with their long mahogany counters polished to a deep shine, their tall mirrors in gilded frames throwing the gaslight back and forth until the whole room seemed to blaze, their pillars and their carved woodwork and their great casks ranged behind the bar, with the brewer's name picked out in gold. The gas jets flared along the walls and over the counter, hissing their soft steady hiss, and the light of them caught the polished pewter and the rows of glasses and the bright brass of the beer engines, and the barmaids moved behind the counter in their clean aprons, pulling the pints and making change and trading talk with the customers, the queens of that small bright kingdom. The floor was strewn each morning with fresh clean sawdust to soak up the spills and the spit, and the air was a thick warm fog of pipe smoke and beer and gas and the breath of the crowd. and over it all rose the great steady roar of talk and laughter that was the very voice of the place. Beneath this bright room lay the dark one, for every public house was built upon its cellar, and the cellar was the secret engine of the whole concern. A steep flight of worn stone steps led down behind a heavy door into the cool, damp dark, and there the great casks of beer rested in their rows upon the stone floor, waiting to be tapped and drawn up to the bar above. And there too the publican kept his stores, his crates of bottles, his spirits under lock, his cleaning things and his odds and ends upon the shelves. It was a place of earth and shadow and old wood, lit by a single candle or a small flickering jet, cool in summer and cold in winter, and the noise of the bright room above came down into it, muffled and far away, the scrape of feet and the clink of glass and the dull murmur of the crowd, as though the cellar lay at the bottom of a deep well, with the world going on somewhere far over its head. To hold the keys of such a house was to hold a small kingdom entire, and the publican who held them was a man of standing in his street, a man the neighbours knew and greeted and depended upon. He ruled the bright bar and the dark cellar and the private rooms behind and above, where he and his family lived their lives apart from the trade, and he opened his doors in the morning and closed them at night by the law's strict hours, and he kept the order of the place, and he knew every face that came through his door and every secret that was spoken across his counter. The bar was a place where the whole life of the street was laid bare, where men drank and boasted and quarrelled and confessed, where matches were made and bargains struck and griefs drowned, and the publican stood at the centre of it all, watching, listening, serving the quiet keeper of the warmth that drew the whole street in. It was to this trade, the trade of the public house, that the quiet barber turned at last, sometime in the middle years of the 1890s, setting down the razor and the lather of his old craft, and taking up instead the keys and the counter and the cellar of the licensed house. It was a natural enough rising for a careful man who had saved a little and learned the ways of the city, for the keeping of a public house stood a step above the keeping of a barber's shop, a more settled and more respected trade, and it gave a man a house to live in and a standing in his street and a steady custom that came to his door of its own accord, every evening of the week, and so he passed from the one trade to the other, from the chair to the bar, from the soap and the blade to the cask and the bottle, and he learned the new craft as he had learned the old, quietly and well, and made himself a publican among publicans. It was around this turning of his trade that he set aside at last the name he had carried out of the old country, the long foreign name that had marked him as a stranger in every street, and took up in its place a plain English name that would draw no eye and raise no question. He had been living with a woman who bore that name, and when she passed out of his life he kept the name itself, as a man might keep a coat left behind, and wore it from then on as his own, and under it he was simply an Englishman among Englishmen, a publican with a common name behind a common bar. The foreign past folded away out of sight, behind the new and ordinary word. It was the easiest thing in the world to do in that city, where no paper followed a man and no neighbour checked his story, and with that small change he shed the last clear mark of where he had come from, and became, to all who met him, exactly what he seemed. In the bright bar of his house he was, by all accounts, an obliging and pleasant host, neat in his dress and soft in his speech, a small dark man with a careful manner who pulled the pints and made the change and traded talk across the counter like any other keeper of a licensed house. The customers found nothing in him to remark upon, nothing to fear, nothing even to remember particularly, for he was mild and quiet and gave no offence, and he kept his house in good order, and he was in every visible way an ordinary publican going about an ordinary trade. The neighbours saw the bright bar and the genial host, and took him for what he appeared to be, and asked no more, for why should they ask more, when a man stood plainly before them doing plainly the work of his trade, with a smile and a soft word for every face that came through his door. But a public house, for all its brightness, was a thing with a dark beneath it, and the man who kept it lived as much in the shadowed rooms behind the bar as in the bright room before it. The private chambers above, where the publican and his household slept and ate and lived their lives away from the trade, were closed off from the world entirely, and what passed within them was no one's affair but the keeper's own, for the law that watched the bar so closely did not climb the private stair. And the cellar below, with its casks and its bottles and its single small flame, was the keeper's own ground utterly, a place he alone had reason to enter, where he kept his stores and his secrets in the cool dark, and where a man who understood the bottles and the powders and the careful measure of a dose might keep such things too, ranged quietly upon a shelf among the cleaning stuffs and the spirits. And no one would ever think to look, and no one would ever know. For the deep truth of the public house was that it joined together, in one single building, the brightest and the most watched room in all the street and the darkest and most private rooms a man could hope to own. Below the stairs the whole loud world came crowding in each night, full of company and noise and 100 watching eyes, and yet only a few feet away, behind a door and up a stair, or down a stair, were rooms where a man might be utterly alone and utterly unobserved, where he might do anything at all in perfect silence while the crowd laughed and drank a wall's thickness away. The house held both the crowd and the solitude, both the warmth and the cold, both the bright bar and the black cellar, and the man who held its keys held the freedom to move between them as he pleased, to be the genial host in the lamplight one moment, and the solitary keeper of the dark the next, and no one in all the noise above would ever mark the difference. So the public houses of the great city glowed on through the long nights, corner after corner, street after street, their windows pouring warm light onto the cold wet stones, their doors swinging, their gas jets hissing, their crowds rising and falling like a tide. And in one of them, behind one bright bar in one ordinary street, the quiet man with the new plain name stood pulling pints and trading talk and keeping his good order, the very picture of a steady honest tradesman, with the dark cellar cool beneath his feet, and the private room silent above his head, and the careful patient knowledge folded away unseen behind his mild and pleasant face. The crowd came in from the cold and warmed itself at his counter and went out again into the fog, and not one soul among them ever felt the chill that lay so close beneath the warmth, or guessed that the brightest room in the street was built, like every other, upon a darkness underneath. And the great city held its public houses the way the night holds its scattered fires, thousands of small warm rooms burning against the cold dark, each one bright and full of life and noise, each one closed and silent in the rooms behind, and the people moved between them through the foggy street seeking warmth and company, and the blessed forgetting of their hard days. The lamps burned, and the casks were tapped, and the sawdust was swept and strewn fresh each morning, and the cellars kept their cool dark stores beneath the bright bars, and the whole enormous trade rolled on through the city's nights as it had for centuries, indifferent and warm and full of trust, asking nothing of the men who kept it, but that they pull the pints and keep the order and open their doors each evening to the cold and waiting street. Chapter 7. The music of the razor far to the south of the great smoky city, where the land of England ran down at last to meet the sea, there stood an old fishing town built into the fold between two great green hills, and the sea was the first thing and the last thing in all the life of that place. It came up grey and restless under the wide sodden sky, and it broke white along the shingle beach in a sound that never stopped. Day or night, summer or winter, the long, slow breathing of the water on the stones. The fishing boats were drawn up high on the shingle above the tide, their hulls dark and their nets hung out to dry, and behind them rose the strange tall huts of black tarred wood where the fishermen kept their gear, narrow towers leaning together against the wind, salted and weathered by 100 years of storms. The town itself was old, far older than the great city to the north, and its oldest part lay crowded in the valley between the hills, a maze of steep and narrow streets, where the little houses leaned over the lanes and the smell of fish and salt and tar hung always in the air. Up on the high cliffs the wind came in hard off the water, and the gulls wheeled and cried above the rooftops, and from the heights a person could look down on the whole town spread below, the church towers and the chimneys and the crooked streets, and beyond them the great grey plain of the sea running out to the edge of the world. Along the front the newer town had grown, with its tall white lodging houses and a long iron pier reaching out over the waves, where in the warm months the visitors came to walk and take the air. But in the back streets the old fishing life went on as it always had, hard and poor and salted through with the sea. It was to this town, in the late winter of the year 1896, that a barber came down from the great city to set himself up in trade, and he did not come alone. He came with a woman who passed as his wife, though no true marriage had ever joined them, and with her young son, a small boy brought along to this new life by the sea. The woman's name was Mary Isabella Spink, and she had been born some years before him, and her life by the time she reached the seaside town had already known a good deal of sorrow. She had been married once, in truth, to a railway porter, a working man who had left her and taken their elder boy with him on account of her fondness for drink, which had grown upon her over the hard years until it ruled her. She had been left with a younger child and with a small legacy of money come down to her from her grandfather, and it was that money, more than anything else, that had drawn the quiet barber to her side. In the great city he had lodged in the same house as her, in the northern suburbs, and there the two had come together, and there they had told the people of the house that they had been wed. Though it was no true wedding at all, the both still had living husbands and wives elsewhere in the world. With a portion of her money they had come down to the sea, and there they leased a small lock-up shop in one of the narrow streets of the old town, a barber's shop with the chair and the mirror and the shelf of bottles, and there the barber hung out his pole and opened his door to the trade of the town. The little family took rooms in lodging-houses up the steep streets of the old quarter, first in one and then in another a few minutes' walk away, and they settled into the life of the seaside town, the barber and the woman and the small quiet boy. At first the shop did poorly, for there were barbers enough already in the town, and the new man was a stranger, but he was a clever tradesman with an eye for what would draw a custom, and he hit upon a notion that made his shop the talk of the whole place. The woman could play the piano, and so he leased an instrument and set it up within the shop, and while he lathered and shaved and trimmed the hair of his customers, she sat and played the popular airs of the day, and the men came not only for the shave but for the music, and the men came not only for the shave but for the music, and the fame of the musical shaves spread through the town until the little shop was busy from morning to night. For a season it brought in a good income, more than the barber had ever known, and with the money he even bought himself a small sailing boat to take out upon the grey water, and to all the world the seaside town had brought the strange new family a measure of good fortune. But the good fortune was a thin skin stretched over something cold and hard beneath. For behind the door of the lodging-house the barber was not the genial man the customers knew. He was harsh with the woman, and the harshness grew, and there were beatings, and the small boy lived in the shadow of it. A child in a house where there was little kindness and a great deal of fear. The woman's drinking did not ease in the seaside town, but worsened, for she was unhappy, and she found her comfort where she had always found it, in the ale that she would send out for and take in secret, leaning into the bottle as into the only soft thing left to her. She had come down to the sea, hoping perhaps for a new and better life, and instead she found the same hard hand and the same lonely sorrow, only now far from the city and the few people who had known her, alone in a strange town with a man who did not love her, and a small son who could not protect her. The town around them knew little and asked less. To the customers in the shop, the barber was a clever and obliging fellow with a gift for drawing a crowd, and the woman at the piano was his wife, and the music was a fine novelty, and that was the whole of what the town saw or cared to see. The neighbours in the lodging-houses heard perhaps a raised voice now and then through the thin walls, the common sound of the hard marriage, and thought no more of it, for such things were not their affair. The boy went about the steep streets as the children of the town went about them, and the boats went out and came in, and the gulls cried over the rooftops, and the great grey sea breathed on the shingle below, and beneath the bright surface of the musical shaves and the small sailing boat the woman's life ran quietly down into lowliness and drink and fear, unseen by anyone at all, and as the months passed, the good fortune began to fade as quickly as it had come. The novelty of the musical shaves wore thin, for a town will tire of any wonder given time, and the custom fell away, and the little shop that had been so busy grew quiet again. The income that had seemed so fine dwindled back to a hard scraping, and the small comforts the money had bought lost their shine, and the family that had come down to the sea with hopes and the legacy found itself once more pressed and poor in a strange town by the water. The barber, restless as he had always been, restless as he would always be, turned his eyes back toward the great city to the north, where the trade was larger and a clever man might rise higher, and he began to think of leaving the sea behind, and trying his fortune once more among the crowds and the smoke. The woman who had brought the money that bought it all had little say in any of it, for she had given herself and her legacy into the barber's keeping, and what was left of either was his to dispose of as he chose. She had grown thinner over the seaside months, worn down by the drink and the unhappiness and the hard hand of the man she lived with, and the bloom that had once been on her was gone, and she was tired in the deep way that comes to a person who has lost hope. Whatever she had been before the sorrows of her life had bent her, a young wife once with a husband and 2 sons and a future before her, she was now a faded and frightened woman, in a seaside lodging house, bound to a man who valued her chiefly for the money she had brought, and the music she had made in the little shop was the last bright thing she would give to the world. So the family made ready to leave the old town by the sea, to fold up the brief seaside chapter of their lives and carry it back to the great city. And the little shop with its silent piano was given up, and the small sailing boat was sold or left behind, and the rooms in the steep lodging houses were vacated for other tenants. The barber gathered up what remained of the money and of his trade, and the woman gathered up her small son and her few belongings and her tired hopes, and together they turned their backs on the sea. Behind them the old fishing town went on exactly as it had gone on for centuries. The boats drawn up on the shingle, the black net huts leaning together against the wind, the gulls wheeling and crying over the crooked streets, the long grey waves breaking endlessly upon the stones, taking no more notice of the family that left than it had taken of the family that came. For the sea keeps no account of the small lives that pass along its shore, and the great water breathed on as it always breathed, in and out upon the shingle, under the wide southern sky, while up in the town the lamps came on in the early dark, and the smell of fish and salt and tar drifted through the narrow lanes. The old town settled into its evening as it had settled into 10,000 evenings before, indifferent and ancient and salted through with the sea, and the music that had filled the little shop fell silent and was forgotten, and the woman who had made it went away northward into the smoke with the man who walked beside her, carrying her sorrow and her son and the last of her grandfather's money out the long road toward the city, where the fog waited, and the crowded streets, and the bright public houses with their warm gaslight and their dark cellars underneath. Chapter 8. The Bitter Christmas. There was a quarter on the northern edge of the old city, beyond the great thoroughfare of the city road, where the streets were close and grey and the public houses stood thick on the corners, and it was a poor and crowded district of working people, of small tradesmen and labourers and clerks, packed into the tall sooty houses that lined the narrow ways. In a small square set back from the main road there stood a public house, the Prince of Wales, and like every house of its kind, it glowed at evening with the warm yellow light of its gas jets, and its doors swung open to let out the noise and the warmth into the cold, and the working men of the quarter came in from the dark streets to drink away the weariness of the day. It was an ordinary house in an ordinary street, one among the thousands of the great city, and the man who came to manage it in the year 1897 was, to all who saw him, an ordinary publican going about an ordinary trade. He had come up from the sea with the woman who passed as his wife and her young son, the music of the seaside shop fallen silent behind them, and he had taken on the keeping of this public house in the grey northern quarter, and there the little family settled into the rooms above the bar. By day and by evening the man stood behind his counter, genial and obliging, pulling the pints and trading talk with his customers, the very picture of a steady host, and the woman lived in the rooms above, among the smells of beer and smoke that rose up through the floor, far from the sea and the seaside town, and the brief bright fame of the musical shaves. The boy went about the grey streets as a poor child of the city went about them, and the days passed in the close round of the public house, the opening and the closing, the drawing of the beer from the cellar, and the carrying of it up to the bright bar above. It was in the rooms above the Prince of Wales that the woman began to fall ill. The sickness came on slowly at first, a queasiness, a turning of the stomach, a loss of appetite, and then it deepened into something harder to bear, a violent and repeated vomiting, a burning pain low in the body, a thirst that could not be slaked. She grew weak and then weaker, and she could keep little down, and the flesh began to fall away from her, so that she who had already been worn and faded by her hard life, now wasted before the eyes of those who tended her, growing thinner and greyer by the week. A doctor was called to her bedside, a respectable physician of the quarter, and he came and looked at her and pondered her symptoms, the wasting and the vomiting and the weakness, and he treated her as best he could with the medicines of the day, but she did not mend, and the slow decline went on. Through all of it the man was constant at her side. He nursed her with a devotion that those who saw it found remarkable, never leaving her for long, tending to her wants, preparing the things she was to take, sitting by her bed in the dim room above the noise of the bar, the very model of a loving and faithful husband watching over a dying wife. Women of the quarter came in to help with the nursing, as was the custom among the poor, for there were no proper nurses to be had, and the neighbours did what they could, and these women sat with the sick woman through the long hours and tended her, and marked the dreadful progress of her wasting. One of them, who helped to care for her, would afterwards speak of the state to which the patient was reduced, saying that by the end she was no more than a skeleton, the flesh gone from her bones, a living woman worn down almost to nothing in the close grey room. For this was the cruel art of the thing, that the slow wasting and the vomiting and the weakness wore the very mask of a natural death. In that age, in those crowded grey quarters, people died in just this way all the time, of the consumption that ate slowly at the lungs, of the wasting fevers and the diseases of the stomach and the bowels that carried off the poor in their thousands, lingering for weeks or months, growing thinner and weaker until the end came. A woman who had been a heavy drinker, worn down and faded already, who now sickened and wasted and could not keep her food, was a sight so common in those streets that it raised no alarm at all, and the doctor who attended her saw in her decline only one more case of the slow diseases that filled the graveyards of the city, and looked no deeper, for he had no reason in the world to look, and so the woman came to her end in the deep of the winter, on the morning of Christmas Day, in the year 1897, in the rooms above the public house, while down in the streets the city kept its great feast, and the bells rang out over the rooftops for the holy day. She died worn to a shadow, after weeks of suffering, with the man who had tended her so faithfully at her side, and one of the women who had nursed her, would afterward tell of how he stood looking down at the still body, and called out her name, calling her to speak to him, and then went into the next room and wept, and then went down the stairs and opened the doors of the public house for the day's trade, as though nothing at all had happened. The bright bar filled with its Christmas custom, the gas jets flared, the beer was drawn up from the cool dark cellar, and above the warmth and the noise, the dead woman lay alone in the quiet room. The doctor who had attended her gave the cause of her death as the wasting disease of the lungs, the consumption that took so many, and the certificate was written and signed, and no one questioned it, for there was nothing in the long, slow death of a worn and drinking woman to make any honest physician pause. She was carried out from the public house and taken to a burying ground in the eastern suburbs, and there she was laid, not in a grave of her own, but in a common grave, a deep pit in the poor ground where the bodies of those who could not pay for better were laid one above another, coffin upon coffin, far down in the cold earth, with many strangers stacked above her. It was the burial of the poor, the burial of the forgotten, and the woman who had once had a husband and 2 sons, and a small legacy, and a future, was lowered into the common pit and covered over, and the world above closed up and went on, and her name passed out of the daily talk of the streets as though it had never been. She left behind her small son, the boy who had come down to the sea and back again, now motherless in the grey city, his mother gone into the common ground, and his future a hard and uncertain thing in a world that had little mercy for the poor and the orphaned. And she left behind too a thing that no one saw and no one suspected, a quiet truth folded away in the rooms above the public house, hidden behind the mask of the faithful husband and the wasting disease and the common grave. For the slow death that had worn her down to a skeleton had not been the work of any natural sickness at all, but the patient work of a hand that knew the body and the bottle, and the careful measure of a dose, given a little at a time over the long weeks, in the food and the drink and the medicine that the loving husband had prepared with his own hands at the bedside. But no one knew it, and no one looked, and the certificate said, consumption. And the common grave closed over her, and the secret went down into the dark earth with her, and lay still. In the rooms above the Prince of Wales, the man went on with his trade, the genial publican behind his bright bar, and the custom came and went, and the gas jets flared and were turned down, and the cellar gave up its beer to the thirsty quarter night after night. The grey streets outside ran on as they had always run, full of the hard ordinary life of the working poor, the labourers and the clerks and the small tradesmen, coming and going under the smudged yellow lamps, and not one among them gave a thought to the worn woman who had wasted away above the public house and gone into the common ground at Christmas. She had been poor and faded, and a stranger to most of them, the sort of woman the great city swallowed without a ripple, and the city swallowed her now, as it had swallowed so many, and closed over the place where she had been, and kept on. And the winter held the city in its grey grip, and the fog came up off the river to fill the streets at evening, and the public houses glowed warm against the cold as they always glowed, and far out in the eastern suburbs the common grave lay quiet under the frost, with its many sleepers stacked deep in the dark. The bells that had rung for the holy day fell silent, and the great feast passed, and the ordinary days came back, grey and cold and short, and the life of the quarter rolled on around the bright public house as the sea had rolled on around the seaside town, indifferent and ceaseless, keeping no account of the woman who had gone. The gas burned low behind the frosted glass, and the streets emptied toward midnight, and over the whole of the great cold city the snow began to fall, soft and slow and silent, settling white upon the rooftops and the lamps and the deep forgotten ground where the poor lay sleeping. Chapter 9. The Chemist's Shelf. In every street of every quarter of the great city there stood a particular kind of shop, marked by the great glass vessels in its window filled with coloured water, ruby and emerald and deep blue, that caught the gaslight at evening and glowed like jewels above the pavement. And this was the shop of the chemist and druggist, the place to which the people came for their cures. It was a place of 1,000 small drawers and 100 ranked bottles, of polished mahogany counters and shelves that rose to the ceiling, each bottle labelled in Latin in a careful hand, each drawer holding its powder or its root or its dried herb, and over it all hung a smell compounded of 100 things at once, of camphor and peppermint and bitter aloes and sweet syrups and the sharp clean tang of spirits. Behind the counter stood the chemist in his apron, a figure of trust in the light of the street, a man who weighed out the powders on his little brass scales, and mixed the draughts and rolled the pills and dispensed to the poor the comfort and the hope of healing. For this was an age that placed a deep and ready faith in its medicines, an age that dosed itself freely and constantly for every ill of the body. The people drank their tonics and their cordials, they swallowed their pills and their powders, they rubbed in their salves and their liniments, and for every complaint under the sun there was a bottle that promised relief, sold over the counter to any who could pay, with no physician's order needed and no questions asked. The chemist's shelves were crowded with the patent cures of the day, the famous bottled remedies whose names were known in every household, sold by the million across the land, promising to cure the cough and the fever and the weak nerves and the disordered stomach and 100 ailments besides, and the people bought them and believed in them and poured them down without a second thought. Among the remedies the chemists kept, and one long trusted by physicians and common folk alike, was a white crystalline powder known by an old and homely name, emetic tartar, or tartar emetic, a preparation made from the metal called antimony. It had been used in the healing arts for centuries, given in small and careful doses to bring on the vomiting that the doctors of the day believed cleared the body of its corrupt humours, given to ease the cough and loosen the chest, given for fevers and for the diseases of the skin, and given even, in a darker custom of the age, in secret to the heavy drinker, slipped into his cup to turn his stomach against the drink and cure him of his craving. It was a medicine found in countless homes and on countless chemists' shelves, familiar and trusted, a thing of healing in the right and careful hand. But the same powder that healed in the small dose killed in the large one, and therein lay its terrible double nature, for the line between the cure and the poison was only a matter of quantity, a thing of grains and measures, and a hand that knew that line could cross it on purpose as easily as an unwary hand might cross it by mistake. Given a little at a time, over days and weeks, in doses too small to kill at once but enough to sicken, the powder worked a slow and dreadful ruin upon the body, and the symptoms it brought on were these: a violent and repeated vomiting, a burning pain in the stomach and the bowels, a raging thirst, a griping of the muscles, a steady wasting of the flesh and failing of the strength, until the sufferer was worn down at last to a skeleton and died. And these symptoms, every one of them, were the very symptoms of the natural diseases that filled the graveyards of the age, of the wasting fevers and the diseases of the stomach, so that a death by the slow poison wore the perfect mask of a death by natural sickness, and a doctor at the bedside, seeing only the vomiting and the wasting, would write down a natural cause, and never dream of the truth. There was another property of the powder, stranger still, that made it the more terrible. The antimony of which it was made did not pass away from the body after death as other poisons did, but lingered in the flesh, and it had upon the dead body the effect of a preservative, drawing out the moisture and holding the flesh from its natural decay, so that a body laden with it would lie in the grave far better preserved than it had any right to be, almost untouched by the long rot that should have claimed it. A face that should have crumbled to nothing in the years beneath the earth might be found whole and recognizable, as though the death were recent, and this uncanny preserving was the silent mark the poison left upon its victims, a mark written deep in the flesh itself. that would keep and not fade, waiting in the dark of the grave to be read by anyone who should ever think to look. The law of the land was not blind to the danger of such substances, for the sale of poisons had long troubled the lawmakers, and there were rules laid down to govern it. The strongest poisons, the deadly ones most often used for murder, could not be sold freely to anyone who walked in off the street, but had to be entered in a register kept by the chemist, with the name of the buyer, and the date and the amount and the purpose all written down, so that any poison sold might be traced afterward to the hand that bought it. Yet the rules were uneven and the register was easily fed a false name, for the chemist had no way to know whether the pleasant customer before him was who he said he was, and many a substance with murder in it could still be had with little trouble by a person who knew what to ask for, and could give some honest-sounding reason for the want of it. A man who understood the medicines, who could speak of them with the easy knowledge of one who had trained in the healing arts, who came with a plain face and a steady manner, and signed the register with a borrowed name, drew no suspicion at all. And so it was that the slow poison made its quiet way out of the bright trusting chemist's shop, and into the close rooms where the sick lay tended, carried there in a small packet of white powder by a hand that knew exactly what it held, and exactly what it meant to do with it. There was no need for violence, no need for the knife or the cord or the sudden blow that left its mark and raised its hue and cry. There was only the patient adding of a little to the food, a little to the drink, a little to the very medicine given to ease the suffering, day after day, while the loving attendants at the bedside masked the deed and the wasting wore the face of disease. It was a method made for an age that trusted its medicines and dosed itself freely, and asked no questions of the chemist's shelf, an age in which the poison and the cure stood side by side in the same bottle, and a careful hand might reach for either, and no one would ever see which one it chose. This was the deeper horror of the thing, far deeper than any single hand that wielded it, for the poison drew its power from the very trust that held the age together. People trusted their medicines, and so a medicine could kill them. They trusted the chemist who sold the powder, and the chemist trusted the customer who bought it. They trusted the one who tended them in sickness, who prepared their food and held the cup to their lips, and so the one who tended them could destroy them. They trusted the doctor to read the cause of death aright, and the doctor, trusting in turn the common course of common disease, read it wrong. Layer upon layer of ordinary trust, the trust that let the great city live at all, the trust between buyer and seller and patient and healer, and through every layer of it, the slow poison passed unhindered, because no one in all that long chain of trust ever thought to suspect that the white powder on the shelf, the homely old remedy known in every household, might be carried off to do murder in a quiet room. For the powder itself was innocent, as the razor was innocent, and the cellar was innocent, and the chemist's shop was innocent, a thing made by honest art for the easing of suffering, used by 10,000 careful hands for healing in the years before and the years after. The evil lay not in the substance, but in the use, in the one who took the trusted thing and turned it to an untrusted end, who saw in the homely white powder not a cure but an instrument, and reached for it not to heal but to harm. The age had made the thing freely available, and the age had made it freely trusted, and the age had filled its homes with poisons, and its shelves with cures, and drawn no clear line between them, and in doing so it had laid ready to hand, for any patient and knowing soul who should want it, a means of death so quiet and so well disguised that it might never be found out at all. So the chemist's shops glowed on through the evenings, all across the great city, their great glass vessels burning ruby and emerald in the gaslight above the pavements, their drawers and bottles ranked in the warm dim interiors, their aproned keepers weighing out the powders on the little brass scales for the trusting people of the streets. The cures and the comforts passed across the counters into the eager hands of the sick and the worried and the poor, and the homely white powder sat upon its shelf among the rest, between the cough cures and the tonics, asking nothing, meaning nothing, waiting only for the hand that would reach for it. And the great city dosed itself and trusted itself and died of its ordinary diseases in its thousands, and laid its dead in the deep cold ground, and never once looked twice at the small bright shop on the corner with the coloured lights in its window where healing and death stood side by side upon the same quiet shelf, behind the same clean glass, in the same trusting yellow glow. Chapter 10. A long way from home, across the river from the old city, on the southern bank where the bridges came down, There lay an ancient and crowded quarter called the Borough, and the parish of Southwark spread around it, grey and close and poor. Spread around it, grey and close and poor. It was a district built upon trade and travel, for here the great roads from the south had always come up to the river crossing, and here the inns and the taverns had stood for hundreds of years to take in the travellers, and the smell of the quarter was the smell of hops and malt from the great breweries, of leather from the tanneries, of the river mud and the smoke and the press of people. The streets were narrow and the courts behind them narrower still, and the people were packed into the old houses as tightly as anywhere in all the city, and the public houses stood thick along the ways, one after another, their lamps glowing in the dusk, for in a quarter so poor and so weary there was always a thirst to be served. In a street called Union Street, set among the warehouses and the crowded courts of Southwark, there stood a public house called the Monument Tavern, and it was to this house, after the woman of the seaside town had wasted away and gone into the common ground, that the quiet publican came to keep his trade. He did not stay long alone, for he was a man who seemed unable to be without a woman at his side, and before very long he had taken another, a woman he set behind his bar and gave out to all the world as his wife, though once again no true marriage had ever joined them. Her name was Bessie Taylor, and she had come down to the great city from the far north country, from the green fields and quiet villages of Cheshire, and she was a capable and respectable woman who had made her own way in the world, having managed a restaurant before she came to the public house and the man who kept it. She was not a poor faded creature worn down by drink, as the woman before her had been, but a woman of some spirit and standing, used to work and used to managing, and she came to the public house perhaps with hopes of a settled life and a home of her own. But the man behind the bar was not the genial host to her that he was to his customers, and behind the door of their rooms the same hard hand showed itself that had showed itself before. He grew harsh with her and then cruel, and he shouted at her and frightened her, and there came a time when he threatened her very life, drawing out a pistol and pointing it at her in his rage, so that the woman who had come down from the north with her hopes and her good name found herself bound to a man who terrified her, far from her family and the green country of her birth. And then, as the seasons turned, the woman began to sicken. It came on as it had come on before, with the turning of the stomach and the vomiting and the burning pain low in the body, and the slow wasting of the flesh, and she grew thin and weak and could not keep her food, and the bloom of health went out of her. A friend of hers, a woman who had known her, and who visited her often through the illness, marked the dreadful change in her, and tried to comfort her, and she would come to the public house to ask after her friend, and to sit with her, and the man who kept the house met her sometimes with cold, cruel jokes, telling her once that her friend was dead when she was not, so that the visitor ran up the stairs in grief only to find the sick woman still living in her bed. Such was the spirit of the house in which the woman lay dying, a house where her suffering was met with mockery, and where the one who tended her by day was the very one who was the cause of all her pain. For a time the man took the sick woman away from the great city altogether, perhaps because her long illness in the public house had begun to draw the notice of those around them, and he carried her off to a quiet market town in the green country to the north of the city, a pleasant old town of coaching inns and market squares set among the fields of Hertfordshire. There he took the keeping of another public house, an old inn in the heart of the little town, and there for a season they lived among the country people, far from the crowds and the smoke and the watching eyes of the borough. The town was a gentle place, with its market held in the open square, its old church tower rising above the rooftops, its slow country rhythm of market days and quiet evenings, a world apart from the grey, crowded quarter they had left behind, and to the people of the town the newcomers were simply the keepers of the inn, the man and his ailing wife. But the green country and the quiet town did the sick woman no good, for the cause of her sickness had come with her, in the hand that prepared her food and her medicine, and she did not mend. Her decline went on among the fields as it had gone on in the city, the wasting and the vomiting and the failing strength. And after a time the man gave up the country inn and brought her back again to the great city, back across the river to the crowded quarter of the borough, back to the Monument Tavern in Union Street. There the doctors did what they could for her, and at one point she was even taken under the knife, an operation performed upon her in the hope of finding and mending whatever ailed her. But it brought her no relief, for there was nothing in her body for the knife to find, no growth, no blockage that any honest examination could explain, Only the slow secret ruin worked upon her from within by the patient poison none of them suspected. And so the capable woman from the green north country, who had come to the city with her good name and her hopes of a home, was worn down week by week to a shadow of herself, lying in the rooms above the public house in the smoke and the noise of the borough, far from the fields and the family of her birth, tended by the very hand that was killing her. She suffered long, far longer than the woman before her, clinging to life through months of pain and wasting, while the man kept his bright bar below and pulled his pints and traded his talk and came up the stairs to play the faithful husband at her bedside. The friend who loved her watched her fade and could do nothing, and the doctors pondered her case and could find no answer, and the slow grey decline went on, until at last, in the cold middle of February, in the year 1901, the woman died. Her death, like the death before it, wore the face of natural sickness, and the doctor who had attended her gave the cause as exhaustion brought on by the long vomiting and the wasting, and no one questioned it, for there was nothing in the long, slow death of an ailing woman to make any honest physician pause. The man who had kept her did a thing that showed the coldness in him plain, for when the woman was dead he would not pay to bury her, and the cost of her funeral was laid upon her own family, the people of the North Country who had to gather what they could to lay their daughter and sister to rest. Her body was carried away out of the city, away from the grey, crowded borough where she had suffered and died, and taken north to the green country of her birth, and laid in the quiet churchyard of a Cheshire village among the people and the fields she had come from, a long way from the public house and the man and the city that had been the ruin of her. It is said that the man himself composed the words that were set upon her coffin, some tender lines of mourning, a last cruel mockery, in which the hand that had killed her wrote her sorrowing farewell. But whether that is so or not, the woman was laid in the northern earth in the place where she had been a girl, far from the borough and its smoke and its sorrow. The green fields of Cheshire closed over her, and the old church tower stood above her grave, and the slow country seasons turned over the quiet churchyard, and she lay at last at peace in the country of her birth, among her own people, the capable woman who had gone down to the great city full of hope and been worn away to nothing in the rooms above a public house in a quarter she had never called home. And back in the borough the Monument Tavern stood as it had stood, its lamps blowing in the dusk along Union Street, its bar filling and emptying with the thirsty people of the quarter, its cellar giving up its beer to the long evenings, and the man behind the counter went on with his trade as though no woman had ever sickened and died in the rooms above. The breweries breathed out their smell of hops over the crowded streets, and the river slid by under the bridges a few turnings away, and the great quarter of Southwark drew its weary breath and lived on, packed and poor and indifferent, keeping no account of the woman who had gone north to her grave. The grey February closed over the borough, and the fog came up off the river to fill the narrow ways, and the gas lamps burned low and yellow above the wet stones of Union Street, and the public house glowed warm against the cold, and the dark cellar lay quiet beneath it, cool and shadowed lay quiet beneath it, cool and shadowed, waiting in its silence under the noise of the living world above. Chapter 11. The Crown on Borough High Street. The great road that came up through Southwark to the river crossing was the Borough High Street, an ancient way that had carried travellers toward the bridge for longer than anyone could remember, and along it stood the old inns and the shops and the public houses, crowded close together in the heart of the southern quarter. It was a busy road and a loud one, full of carts and barrows and the press of working people, and the trams and the omnibuses rattled along it, and the costermongers cried their wares at the curb, and the public houses opened their doors to the stream of trade that flowed up and down the high street all the day and half the night. At a number along this road there stood a public house called the Crown, and it was here, after a fire had driven the man from his tavern in Union Street, that he came to keep his trade in the last of his public houses, and here that the last act of the long quiet tragedy would be played out. He did not come to the Crown alone, for once again there was a woman at his side, the youngest of all the women he had taken, a girl scarcely out of her own girlhood, not yet 20 years of age. Her name was Maud Marsh, and she had come up to the great city from a town to the south, from a respectable working family, a labourer's daughter, fresh and young, and looking for honest work, and she had answered an advertisement for a barmaid, and so come into the public house and the keeping of the man who ran it. She was a bright and lively girl with her life still before her, and she had a mother and a father and brothers and sisters who loved her and kept close watch over her welfare, a family near enough to the city to visit and to write, and to take an interest in how their girl was faring among the public houses of the borough. The man took her, as he had taken the others, and gave her out to the world as his wife, though there was no true marriage, only the same false show that had served him before, and the young girl was set behind the bar of the Crown to pull the pints and serve the custom and live in the rooms above with the man who claimed her. To the people of the High Street, she was the publican's young wife, a pleasant, lively girl serving in the bar, and the house went on with its trade as the public houses of the quarter all went on, the doors swinging, the gas jets flaring, the beer drawn up from the cool dark cellar to the bright warm bar. But behind the door of the rooms above, the same old harshness showed itself once more, for the man wearied of the young girl as he had wearied of the others, and grew cold and cruel toward her, and the bright life that had been in her began to dim under the weight of the unhappy house. And then, as it had come to the others, the sickness came to her. It began in the way it had begun before, with the turning of the stomach and the vomiting and the burning pain, and the loss of appetite, and the slow draining away of her strength. And the lively young girl who had come up from the south so full of life began to fade and to waste in the rooms above the public house. A doctor was called to attend her, a respectable physician of the quarter, and he came and examined her, and treated her with the medicines of the day. But she did not mend, and the violent vomiting went on, and the pain went on, and the flesh fell away from her young frame, and she grew weaker by the week, lying in her bed in the close room above the noise of the bar, a girl not yet 20 wasting toward her death. But this time the slow decline did not pass unwatched, for this woman, unlike the worn and faded creatures who had gone before her, had a family who loved her, and who lived close enough to watch over her, and they did not like what they saw. Her mother came to the Crown to tend her sick daughter, and to help with the nursing, as a mother would, sitting by the girl's bed through the long hours, and the family marked the strangeness of the illness, the way it would seem to ease a little, and then return worse than before, the way the girl sickened most after the man had given her something to take. They grew uneasy, and their unease deepened into suspicion, for there was something in the long mysterious wasting of the bright young girl that did not sit right with them, something that the soothing words of the attending doctor could not quite explain away. The mother herself fell ill after a visit to the public house, after taking some food or drink within its walls, sickening suddenly with the same turning of the stomach, and though she recovered, the fright of it sharpened the family's fear, for it seemed that the very house was a place of sickness, that something within it reached out to harm whoever came too close to the dying girl. The family pressed their worry harder, and at last, not content with the attending doctor's helpless pondering, they took it upon themselves to bring in a second physician of their own, a doctor from the family's own town, to come and look at the girl with fresh eyes and tell them honestly what he made of her strange decline. It was a step that the families of the poor rarely took and rarely could afford, the calling in of a second opinion, the refusal to accept the easy answer, and it was this step, this stubborn, loving suspicion of a family that would not be soothed, that broke at last the long silence in which the deaths had hidden. For the calling in of the second doctor frightened the man who kept the house, frightened him as nothing had frightened him before, for he knew what a sharp and questioning eye might find in the wasting girl, and he saw the danger closing in, and in his fear he did a reckless thing, for instead of easing back and letting the slow poison do its quiet work as he had always done, he gave the girl a great dose all at once. A heavy and violent dose meant to carry her off quickly before the questioning doctors could learn the truth, and the girl, already worn down to the edge of death by the long slow poisoning, could not bear it. She was seized with a final agony, a violent and dreadful sickness beyond anything before, and within a day of it she died, in the rooms above the public house on the Borough High Street, on a day in the late autumn of the year 1902, a girl not yet 20 years old, with her mother near her and her family gathered in their grief and their dawning horror. She died, and her death was not like the deaths that had gone before, for it had not slipped quietly past under the mask of natural sickness, but had come too fast and too violently, and there were watching eyes upon it, and there was a family that would not be told that their bright young daughter had simply wasted away of some nameless disease. The girl who had come up from the south so full of life lay still at last in the close room above the bar. Her short life ended, her family bent over her in sorrow and in a terrible growing certainty that something dark and wrong had been done, while down below the public house stood ready for its trade, and the man who kept it moved through his rooms with the cold fear tightening in him, for he had killed too quickly and too clumsily, and the long silence that had covered him for years, had it long silence that had covered him for years, had it loud lad longs whining. The autumn lay grey and cold over the Borough High Street, and the carts and the barrows rattled up and down the ancient way as they had rattled for centuries, and the public houses opened their doors to the stream of trade, and the people of the quarter went about their hard and ordinary lives beneath the smudged yellow lamps. But above the crown, in the room where the young girl lay dead, the air was heavy with grief and with the first cold breath of the truth, and the family kept their watch over the still form of the daughter they had loved. The girl from the southern town who had come up to the city to work and had found instead a slow and secret death in the rooms above a public house. The High Street did not know it yet. The great loud quarter went on about its business as ever, but in that one quiet room above the bar the long darkness had reached its end, and the silence that had buried two women already was broken open at last over the body of the third. And the dusk came down over Southwark and down every dusk, and the lamps were lit along the Borough High Street, and the fog crept up from the river to soften the lights and blur the crowds, and the old road settled toward its evening. In the rooms above the crown, the young girl lay at rest, her suffering over, her family near her in their sorrow, and below them the bright bar waited cold and empty for once, for the trade did not feel right that night in the house where the girl had died. That night in the house where the girl had died. The great quarter breathed its weary breath around them, ancient and crowded and indifferent, and the river slid by dark beneath the bridges, and over the whole of the southern bank the autumn night closed down, quiet and grey. Holding within it, in one still room above one public house, the body of a girl named Maud, and the broken silence that her death had made. Chapter 12. The doctor who would not sign when a person died in the great city. In those years the law required that a doctor set his name to a paper declaring the cause of the death, and it was upon this paper, this certificate, that the whole order of dying rested, for once a doctor had written down a natural cause the body could be buried, and the matter closed, the body could be buried, and the matter closed, and the law would look no further. It was a system built upon the trust placed in the doctors, the belief that an honest physician who had attended the sick would know a natural death when he saw one, and would write the truth, and for the most part the trust held, and the dead went into the ground with their certificates, and were not disturbed, but the whole of it turned upon that single signature, that one stroke of the pen, and a death without a certificate was a death the law could not let pass. A death that must be looked into, and so the refusal of a doctor to sign was a thing of great weight. A door that, once shut, opened the way to all that followed. The young girl who had died above the public house on the Borough High Street did not get her certificate, for the doctor who had attended her would not sign it. He had watched her strange and violent decline, and he had seen the dreadful suddenness of her end, and he had heard the fears of her family and the suspicions they pressed upon him, and when the second physician brought in by the family told him plainly that the girl's symptoms looked to him like the work of an irritant poison, the attending doctor would not put his name to any natural cause. He refused the certificate, and in refusing it he stopped the quiet machinery of burial in its tracks, and the body of the girl could not go into the ground, but must instead be opened and examined, that the truth of her death might be found. It was the loving stubbornness of her family that had forced the question, and it was the honesty of the doctor that would not be soothed, and between them they brought the law at last to the door of the public house. So the body of the girl was given over to examination, and the men who knew the working of poisons took it and opened it and tested the organs within, searching for the trace of any deadly thing, and they found it. Deep in the flesh and the organs of the girl they found the metal called antimony, a great quantity of it, far more than any medicine could account for, gathered in the body in the amounts that meant not treatment but murder. And there was a trace of arsenic too, come in as an impurity with the antimony. But it was the antimony that had done the killing. The truth that had hidden so long behind the mask of natural sickness was written plain at last in the dead girl's own flesh, in the metal that lingered there and would not pass away, and the long quiet wasting that had looked so like disease stood revealed for what it was, a slow and patient poisoning carried out by a knowing hand. And once the truth of the one death was known, the eyes of the law turned at once to the deaths that had gone before. For the men who looked into the matter soon learned that the man who kept the public house had buried 2 other women already, 2 other wives who were no true wives. both of whom had died of long-wasting illnesses much like the one that had killed the girl. The pattern of it leapt out plain once a person knew to look. 3 women taken in turn, each given out as a wife, though none was truly wed, each wasting away over weeks or months of vomiting and pain, each dying of a sickness the doctors had called natural, and the men of the law saw the shape of the thing and moved to open the graves of the first 2 women and learn what their bodies might tell. The order was given, and the 2 graves were found, the common pit in the eastern suburbs, where the first woman lay deep among her many strangers, and the quiet northern churchyard in Cheshire, where the second lay among her own people, and the earth was opened over both of them. And here the poison gave up its last and strangest secret. For when the bodies of the 2 women were raised from the ground, they were found in a state that struck all who saw them with wonder. For they had not rotted away as the dead should rot. The first woman had lain in the earth for some years, and yet her body was found so well preserved, so little touched by decay, that her face was still to be known, as though she had been buried not years, but mere weeks before, and the second woman, dead a shorter time, was found nearly as fresh as the day she was laid down. It was the antimony that had done it, the same metal that had killed them now keeping them, drawing the moisture from their flesh and holding them against the rot, so that the very poison that had wasted them in life had preserved them in death, keeping their bodies whole in the dark earth as a kind of silent witness, waiting all those years to be raised up and read. And when the men examined the 2 preserved bodies, they found in both the same thing they had found in the girl, the antimony gathered deep in the flesh, in the amounts that meant murder, and the 3 deaths were joined together into one, and the truth of all of them stood complete. The man who had kept the public houses was taken into custody while the bodies were still being examined, arrested by an officer of the law who came to the door of the house on the Borough High Street, a quiet and dogged inspector who had been set upon the case. And when the man was taken and his history began to be unwound, a thing came to light that surprised those who learned it. For the genial English publican with the common English name proved to be no Englishman at all, but a foreigner from the far eastern lands, a man who had come to the great city many years before under another name entirely, the long foreign name of his birth, and who had shed that name and taken on an English one and built over his foreign past so smoothly that none of his neighbours had ever guessed it. The plain publican and the foreign barber and the trained hand from the eastern surgery were found to be one and the same man, and the whole of the long-hidden life began to come unfolded in the light. The marriages that were no marriages, the women who had died, the trade in barbering and the older trade in the healing arts, the slow, patient knowledge of the body and the bottle that had been folded away unseen for so many years. For the great gift the city had given him, the gift of beginning again, the gift of laying down one name and one life, and taking up another with no paper to follow him and no neighbour to question him, had been at last undone. The same city that had let him pass unmarked through its crowds for 15 years and more, that had let him move from quarter to quarter and trade to trade and name to name without a single eye following him, now turned and looked at him full, and gathered up the scattered pieces of his hidden life, and laid them out one beside another, until the whole dark shape was plain. The anonymous crowd that had been his shelter became the witnesses against him, the neighbours and the nurses and the friends of the dead women, each with a piece of the story to tell, and the careful patient secrecy that had served him so long unravelled all at once in the cold light of the examination, thread by thread, until nothing of it was left hidden. And so the law took him and held him, the quiet man with the steady hands, and the bodies of the 3 women lay together now in the keeping of those who had read the truth in their flesh. The girl from the southern town newly dead, and the faded woman from the seaside, years gone, and the capable woman from the green north country, all 3 brought at last out of the silence in which their deaths had hidden, all 3 speaking now, through the metal in their bones, the truth that none could speak in life. The trade in barbering and the keeping of public houses was ended, the bright bars and the dark cellars passed to other hands, and the man who had moved through them all like a shadow at the edge of the lamplight was held fast at last in a cell, while the great machinery of the law gathered itself to weigh what he had done. The Borough High Street ran on outside the silent public house, the carts and the barrows rattling up the ancient way, the people pressing along the pavements beneath the smudged yellow lamps, the other public houses opening their doors to the trade as they always did, for the great quarter did not stop its business for the breaking open of one long secret. But the Crown stood quiet and shuttered, its bar dark, its trade ended, and the rooms above where the young girl had died stood empty, and word ran through the streets of the borough and then through the whole of the great city of the publican who had poisoned his women and been found out at last. The autumn deepened toward winter over the southern bank, and the fog came up off the river in the evenings to fill the narrow ways, and the gas lamps burned low and yellow above the wet stones of the High Street, and the great old quarter of Southwark drew its weary breath and held within it now, alongside all its other long memories, the memory of the house where the slow poison had at last been brought into the light. Chapter 13. What the Stones Remember. In the spring of the year 1903, in the great court of the city where the gravest matters of the law were weighed, the man who had kept the public houses was brought to answer for what he had done. The court was an old and solemn place, panelled in dark wood, where the judge sat robed and grave beneath the great sword upon the wall. And the lawyers in their gowns and wigs rose and spoke and sat again, and the people crowded the galleries to look down upon the prisoner in the dock. By the law of that time a man could be charged in one trial with only a single murder, and so of the 3 women whose deaths now lay at his door, he stood charged with the killing of only one, the young girl from the southern town who had died last, and whose death had broken the silence, though the deaths of the other 2 were spoken of as well, to show the dark pattern into which her death fell. The lawyers for the Crown laid out the whole of it before the court. The 3 women given out as wives, though none was truly wed, the slow wasting deaths one after another, the metal found deep in the flesh of all 3, the chemist's register signed in a borrowed name, the long hidden life of the foreign barber who had become an English publican. The men who had examined the bodies came and told what they had found, and the friends and the families and the nurses of the dead women came and told what they had seen. The long sufferings, the cold cruelties, the strange devotion of the man who tended the very women he was killing. And against all of this the prisoner's side offered almost nothing, for there was almost nothing to be offered, no answer that could stand against the metal in the bones. And when the court had heard it all, the men of the jury withdrew to weigh their verdict, and they were gone, only a very few minutes before they came back, for there was little for them to weigh. The verdict was guilty, and the judge pronounced upon the prisoner the sentence that the law then laid down for murder, the sentence of death, and the man who had moved so long unseen through the crowds of the great city was taken down from the dock and carried away to await his end. He had never confessed to any of it, and he would confess to none of it now, for he kept to the last the silence that had served him all his life, refusing even at the end to own the foreign name he had been born with, holding fast to the mask of the man he had made himself, the English publican with the common English name. His first wife from the early days, the Polish woman he had wed long before, came to see him in his cell after the trial. But whatever passed between them he carried with him unspoken, and he gave the world no key to any of it. It was in these weeks, as the trial drew the eyes of the whole nation, that an old question rose again out of the past. For there were those who looked at this man, this foreigner trained in the cutting of flesh, who had come to the eastern parishes in the very year of the Great Terror, and had lived among the crowded lanes through that dreadful autumn, and who wondered. A retired inspector of police, a quiet, dogged man who had walked the beats of the eastern quarter through the worst of the fear, was asked by the newspapermen what he made of it, and he spelled out his suspicions plainly, naming the prisoner and setting down the things that made him believe this might be the very hand that had walked the fog so many years before. He pointed to the man's training in surgery, to his coming to the quarter just as the killings began, to the way the killings had ceased about the time the man had crossed the sea, and he held that here at last might be the answer to the riddle that had haunted the city for 15 years. But others were not so sure, and there was much against the notion, for the hand that had walked the autumn fog had killed with the knife in sudden frenzy in the open street, and this man had killed in slow patience with the quiet bottle in the closed room, and these are very different things, and it is a strange road that leads a man from the one to the other. The question was raised and argued and never answered, and it has never been answered since, for the fog of that autumn kept it secret then and keeps it still, and the truth of who walked the eastern lanes in 1888 went down into the dark with all the others, and was never brought up into the light. Whatever this man was or was not, the old terror remained what it had always been, a darkness that the great crowded quarter had made possible, and then could not name, and it belongs to the fog and not to any single face, and there it must be left. And so, on a grey morning in the early days of April, in the year 1903, within the high walls of a great prison in the south of the city, the sentence of the law was carried out, and the quiet man with the steady hands came to his end. It was done as such things were done in that age, behind the walls and away from the crowds, in the cold early hour, and when it was over his body was buried within the grounds of the prison itself, in the unmarked ground where the law laid those it had put to death, with no stone and no name to mark the place. There he was left, nameless at the last as he had wished to be, and the great machinery of the law that had gathered up his hidden life and laid it bare, now closed over him and turned to other matters, and the long quiet tragedy of the public houses was ended. And now the years run forward, 100 years and more, and the great city that held all of this has changed beyond the knowing of any who lived then. And yet the stones remember, for in this old city the past is never wholly gone. Along the Borough High Street the traffic still pours up toward the river crossing as it has poured for 1,000 years, and the trams are gone and the horses are gone, and the costermongers are gone, but the ancient way remains, and near the old church of St. George the Martyr, whose tower the dying knew, there still stands upon the eastern side of the road, the building that was once the Crown. It pours no beer now, and serves no trade of that old kind, and most who hurry past it never give it a glance, but the shape of it still whispers what it was, in the lines of its windows and the look of its upper floors, a public house turned to other use, standing quiet among the shops and the offices of the living street. Away to the east, in the parishes by the river where the great docks once roared, Cable Street still runs its long course as it ran then, though the docks themselves have fallen silent and the ships no longer crowd their basins, and the crowded courts and the lodging houses and the dark arches have mostly been swept away and built over in the long years between. The seaside town to the south still stands above its shingle, the old fishing quarter folded in its valley between the green hills, the black net huts leaning together as they always leaned, the grey sea breaking endlessly upon the stones, and somewhere among its old streets the little shop where the music once played has long since passed to other hands and other trades. And far to the south of the river, behind its high Victorian walls, the great prison still stands, and still does its work, a grim and crowded place even now, and within its grounds, under the ordinary ground, the unmarked dead still lie where the law laid them long ago. The women lie scattered far apart, as their lives had scattered them. Out in the eastern suburbs of the city, in a burial ground among the streets, the first of them lies still in the common grave where she was laid at Christmas, deep in the poor ground among her many strangers, with no stone to name her. Far away in the green north country, in a quiet churchyard in Cheshire among the fields she had come from, the second of them lies among her own people, and there was once a stone above her that bore the false name she had been given in life, but that name was taken away in time, for too many came to stare, and so she rests now more quietly, more truly her own. And the youngest of them was carried home to her family, to the people who had loved her and watched over her and would not be soothed, and laid to rest among them. The bright young girl whose family's stubborn love had at last broken the long silence and brought the truth into the light. So let them be named, now, softly, in the stillness, for they were living women before they were ever a story, and their names are the truest thing that remains. Mary Isabella Spink, who could play the popular airs upon the piano, and once filled a little seaside shop with music. Bessie Taylor, who had managed her own work and made her own way and came down from the green north country with her good name and her hopes. Maud Marsh, scarcely 20 years of age, bright and lively, fresh from a southern town, with the whole of her life still before her. They were daughters and sisters and friends. They had laughed and worked and loved and dreamed, and each of them, before the slow dark came into her life, had been simply a woman in the world, going about her days, hoping for a little happiness, as every soul that has ever lived has hoped. And in the older fog, in the eastern lanes of that long-ago autumn, there were others too whose names the city has kept, the women of the streets who were lost in the year of the Great Fear, Mary Ann Nichols and Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes and young Mary Jane Kelly, poor women all, worn down by hard lives and then taken by the dark, and they too were living souls before they were a legend. And they too deserve to be spoken gently and remembered as women, and not a horror. The great city holds them all now, the women of the fog and the women of the public houses, scattered in its grounds, in its churchyards, and its common graves, and it has built over the places where they suffered and forgotten the names of most who passed. But here and there a stone remains, and a tower they knew still stands, and an old street still runs where they once walked. The lamps that lit their nights are gone now. The gas long since given way to other light, and the fog that wrapped the city in its yellow arms has thinned and lifted with the passing of the coal fires, and the river slides on beneath the bridges as it always has, cold and patient and old, carrying the years away toward the sea. The borough breathes its evening as it has breathed 10,000 evenings, the old church tower dark against the sky, the quiet building that was the crown standing among the lights of the living street, and out beyond the walls of the prison and away in the far churchyards the women lie at their long rest, scattered and still, holding their lives that were lost and their names that remain. And over all of it the night comes down soft and grey and quiet, as it came down over the gaslight and the fog so long ago, and the great old city keeps its dead and remembers what it can and is still. This was a real chain of crimes, drawn from the documented record of late Victorian and Edwardian London. The three women honoured here, Mary Isabella Spink, Bessie Taylor and Maud Marsh, were true people who lost their lives to poisoning between 1897 and 1902, and their poisoner was tried, convicted, and executed in 1903. The question of whether he was also the unknown killer of the 1888 Whitechapel murders was raised by some at the time, but was never proven, and remains unresolved to this day. The story has been told in remembrance of those who were lost,